The fascination in the technicality of sound was never a driving force for me. It was always, how does this music make me feel? And that's what I actually have carried with me throughout my entire career. I'm less interested in how the record sounds technically, but how it makes me feel when I listen to it. Because how it makes you feel is the initial emotional reaction to a piece of music. Then you can think all you like about it, about why that might happen. But if you have to think first and then try to attach an emotion to it, that's a barrier. So the openness comes from the emotional reaction, the pure emotional reaction to a piece of music, a lyric, and then think about it as much as you want. But sound has a profound impact on that, but I don't approach it from a purely technical point of view, although I am technically proficient, and that's a very important tool to have as a producer. You need to be across all those things. As a filmmaker, needs to know how the camera works, needs to know how to set up a shot. Super important, but that's knowledge to fall back on. My inspiration is the emotional impact any music that I listen to or I'm involved in making has on the listener. When I was 15, 16, maybe even earlier, the record that inspired me to want to go into the music industry was Goodbye Yellow Brick Road by Elton John. I used to look at the back cover and I'd see producer Gus Dudgeon. Now, I didn't know what that meant, but it excited me, it inspired me, and I thought, that's what I'd like to do. I'd like to learn how to do that. How do I do it? And there were a couple of choices that came up, either join a band or go and work in a recording studio. And that's what I did. When I was 17, I got a job as a runner in a studio, and it all grew from that first moment. I went into a studio and was on a recording session, having never been in a studio before. And it was incredibly exciting. At school, I played in a band and enjoyed it. And that could have been an option. But actually, I was drawn to behind the scenes creativity, what went on really under the hood of making records. And that's what really drew me. So I was attracted to the kind of film director comparison rather than the actor performer. Being able to tell a story through music that impacted universally people, even though the specific meaning of the song could have been something quite different. It had a universal meaning, which I think is fascinating about how people write on a specific subject, but there's something about the construction, the words, that leave it open to impact every individual that hears that song, how they attach those stories to their own life. That's what's important in my view, even though the initial creation could have had a completely different meaning. It was pretty eye-opening. I'd go in there and I literally had no idea. And I was a runner, you know, making tea, bringing tea into the studio. But the one thing you learn in those days, and we're talking about 1978 or 79, is you learn how to be in a room with creative people. That sounds very simplistic, but actually knowing how to be in a room and engage, open your ears to the conversations that are going on, be ready and learn, that's crucial. And you need to be able to just soak up everything and listen, not to just what's going on, but multiple conversations. And that's how I learned. And that was very important for me. I graduated to being an engineer, and I got an opportunity to work on an artist called Jerry Rafferty, and he had a huge success with a song called Baker Street. And it was the album after that. I was super inexperienced, and so there were some difficulties with that. But in a way, it was very important to get a sense of what it's actually like to be sitting at the desk. When a musician says, I need more of this in the headphones, I need more of that, you've got to be able to calmly and deliberately service those requests. And there's a huge difference from standing behind the person sitting at the desk to sitting at the desk. It is massive. There was two songwriters who had some great success called Wayne Bickerton and Tony Waddington, who used to come to the studio to record, decided to build their own studio and asked me if I wanted to go and work there. So I did, as an engineer, as a full time engineer. And then when I was at a studio one day, there was a guy there who had just started an engineer, producer, manager agency. And he just said to me, hey, would you like me to represent you? And I said, well, I want to be a producer. He got me a job with a Spanish artist. I went to Madrid to work with this Spanish group who were really cutting edge at the time. We did 3 albums and we had tremendous success in Spain and South America, straight out of the box. They were a very current sort of punk type band. And I went to Madrid completely on my own and did all the engineering and the mixing and everything. And we did 3 records. That was the start of my production career. And then I did a record, I started working in Paris a lot. Started what I call the kind of first act of my production career, which was with world music. It was one of the most inspiring, exciting periods I've ever had in my career. We were working with African artists, Spanish, all that melting pot of world music. And the idea was to work with artists from left field. For example, the first stuff was with an African artist from Guinea called Mory Kanté. He was a kora player, which is a 21-string harp. He came over to Paris, was signed to a label called Decca Records, which was run by this incredible visionary called Philippe Constantin. And we went in and made a record. And the idea was to retain everything that is important to this artist's roots. All the African rhythms, all the vocal phrasing. Make it, but familiar to a Western audience. And the shift in that, it was kind of subtle, but it was profound. One of the tracks on this album that we did was called Yeke Yeke, and it became a smash hit all across Europe. It was like #1 in like 13 countries. It was the real breakout point, and now it remains the most successful African single ever, and the first African single to sell 1 million copies. It had an incredible impact, and that had an incredible impact on me as well, about how to retain what's really fundamental to an artist's sound, but also enable it to be recognizable and familiar to a Western audience without compromising the integrity of that sound, that artist's sound, but make it shine. And that's, I think on that record we did that. It was not through design, because I didn't really know what I was doing. It was crazy. But we were just going on there, just doing what we felt. And that actually is why that record turned out like that, because I didn't really know what we were doing. But we weren't frightened of not knowing. You know, you don't know what you don't know. And that was liberating. And actually, I've got to say, ever since that record, it's been about managing your knowledge compared to liberating your creative thought process. Because once you know, then it's very easy to repeat what you know because it worked last time. And that's a deadly trap to fall into. There was a French group who were from North Africa, from Morocco, called Carte de Séjour. And that opened my mind to the influences of other cultures and how the hybrid of other cultures and Western culture could work in harmony and enhance both. I didn't have that thought process at the time, but that's how it came out. And it included flamenco, included Rai. That really opened my eyes. And there was a period of about 8 years that I worked pretty much exclusively on world music. An artist called Sipa Mabuzi, Hugh Masekela, Youssou N'Dour, Gipsy Kings, Salif Keita, all those incredible artists. And that was inspiring. What's important is that when you come into a project like that, you recognize who this artist is and what makes them special. You don't try to impose your own culture on that artist. You take what they have and you help underpin it and shape it so it's a little more recognizable to a Western ear, rather than coming in and saying, oh, I know, let's put some beats on this, it'll be great. That's a disaster. You need to take what they've got and use all the unfamiliar parts of it, but anchor it with something familiar. And that's, I think, what we did. In any conversation, it's the listening that's important. It's not the transmitting, it's the listening, because you learn all the time from other people. And that's what I've tried to do in terms of the connection with music that I've been involved in making, is listen to what this artist is wanting to do, what they stand for, and what gives them their identity. And that becomes the holy grail. You'd never compromise that. But what you do is work with helping it, supporting it. You're the kind of scaffolding to the songwriting process, the creation process that holds it up and gives it a foundation. That's important, particularly in the world of music, but it holds true for any artist that I've worked with. After that, I started working a little more in England, and I started having a relationship with Decca Records in London. They signed an artist called Russell Watson, who was what we now know as a classical crossover artist, a classical tenor, but came from a humble background. So it was very different from the conventional career path of a classical musician. What our task was to make a record that showcased this artist's incredible voice, but again frame it in a landscape that was accessible to people who would be familiar with classical music and really enjoy it, but might not know the names of the pieces, might even be intimidated to go into a record store and say, hey, have you got this record that sounds a bit like that or was by this guy? So it was all about, in a very similar way that I described the world music, it's taking something that has a sort of niche marketplace and moving it towards the mainstream. And that's what we did with Russell. But I have to say, a huge part of that was his personality and his story and his upbringing. Because unlike a pop record, where you hear a pop record on the radio, you might not know who the artist is. In this area I was moving into, the entry point was through the artist and their story. And what Russell provided with his life was an entry point to the normal person in the street. And that was fascinating. And we went on to have made something like 7 albums and had tremendous success over that in the kind of classical crossover genre, if you like, which was a new area at that time. I then went on to make records with almost all of the kind of classical crossover artists of the time. And then consequently with Andrea Bocelli, Plácido Domingo, many of those artists who were looking for an opportunity to reach a broader audience without compromising their craft and their art. Don Reedman, a music producer and an executive, had to combine, in this case, it was Elvis Presley's voice with the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra, Symphonic Orchestra. He told me about this project. And I said, wow, that's unbelievable. Jokingly, I said, if you want someone to carry your bags on that project, I'm there. We struck up a relationship and we went on to do those projects, which really started the whole of the third act and went on to make about 10 or 11 albums. And they were incredible because they did combine all the facets that up until that point I've sort of used in my toolbox, if you like. And that was the technical and the emotional and the overview, the artistic bigger picture. I found those really inspiring. And the reason being is because although the artist was no longer with us, for me, it gave me the purest connection with the vocal performance. It wasn't diluted with words and description. It was something that the performance spoke directly to the listener.
But as long as a man has the strength to dream, he can redeem.
And everything about how they were feeling on that day and how they were interpreted the song, that information was in that vocal performance. And to be able to draw on that felt like a very pure relationship with the artist, because you're reacting to only one thing. There's no outside distractions. And that really drove the creative direction for those records. Now, on those records, there was also a lot of technical involvement because it required cleaning up the vocals, separating any of the vocals from the sort of backing track, because we replaced everything on those records, and being able to make it feel like that artist was in the room with that orchestra, that required some technique. Being close to that level of talent, that status, that legendary status that carries weight in so many people's lives, that was fantastic. That's like, you know, a bucket list of who do you want to work with. To me, that's the same. It was amazing, amazing. And I love that and still do. Not all of them are the same. You know, the Beach Boys, the band were around. They were very much part of it. So that was exciting, but also terrifying, because we're talking about music that is utterly, utterly iconic. And so that was slightly pressurized, and it took real care and attention. Even though we replaced everything, that's still, you can't take away the influence of the original people that worked on that music. It's very important. Some of the most legendary people, Jerry Wexler on the Aretha stuff, the record I did with Richard Carpenter from the Carpenters, he was there every day. That was fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Def Leppard were there all the time. They were absolutely involved in every aspect of that record. Not everyone liked those records. A lot of purists would say, what on earth are you doing? My feeling was that those were never to replace the original records. This was an opportunity to look at them in a slightly different way. On the Def Leppard, that was the record we did most rearrangements on. There are things like Pour Some Sugar on Me now as a piano ballad, as a duet.
In the name of love, pour some sugar on me. Come on.
And the band were very much drove that. They didn't want a greatest hits with an orchestra on it. There's no point in that. And that was an exciting project to do. It was great, and they were amazing. You know, for me, art, music has open borders, and I don't believe in the level of cultural scrutiny that goes on, because I think everyone, when you create, we're all borrowing from a very, very broad canvas. And so I don't believe in that. I think art is, it has no borders, and the really exciting work is the combinations. You know, when hip hop really came to the fore, you know, when the samplers first came out, you know, other people's records were sampled and just made into a new stuff. It's happened all the time. I find that sort of melting pot of cultures and ideas, really, that's where you find originality. It's not in someone just sort of doing something that they think no one else has done. It's about the influences that come into your life and how you interpret those influences. To me, that's important. The Beach Boys was fascinating, but I then went on to make a solo record with Brian Wilson, and it was about trying to get back to the very origins of those incredible songs, of him sitting in his room playing them on the piano when they first were born, when they first came to life. And the intimacy of that experience It was only piano, all instrumental, but he was playing those songs, all the great, great songs, just as if they were note memos to himself. There was an intimacy and an introspection about how beautifully he played those that was one of the real highlights for me in my life. Creating that level of intimacy was something super important on that record. But also having him later in his life being able to look back. I know he has looked back all the time because he's been touring and everything like that, but there's something about going back to the very nucleus of where they came from, those songs, that gives an insight into the genius. I love that record. It's so simple, but it's beautiful. When people talk about AI and music, it's the big bogeyman. Oh my God, it's going to replace all musicians. It's going to be a disaster. No one's going to ever be able to create again. And I think the conversation is more nuanced than that. I view AI tools currently as amazing tools, just that. Not as replacement, but as incredible tools. A different way to express creativity. We need to keep central to any music creation, however it is, whatever it's created on, whatever platform, the human spirit needs to be central to that. AI tools can be another way of expressing that creativity, not as replacement, but as a way of expressing the human spirit in a different way. 95% of AI-generated music will be absolutely terrible because it has no human connection. 95% of human-generated music is absolutely terrible. 95% of artists are not very good. But we all are attracted to the top 5% of the ones that have something that moves us, that makes us think, and have a profound effect on our lives. And I see the AI tools that are being developed at this moment as a tool to express that human emotion in a different way that we're used to. But listen, it's going to be bumpy.